Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We're here today to talk about the situation in Israel, the Middle East, and national security. I'm excited to be joined by two members of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors, who are two of the best security, national security, and international experts in the world. One is Heather Heldman, who worked in the Obama State Department, worked at the Hague, and started her own international political risk consulting firm called Luminae Group. I'm also joined by another member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. Dr. John Lenczowski runs the Institute for World Politics, a graduate program to help U.S. students become experts in statecraft. Previous to that, he was President Reagan's national security advisor on the Soviet Union. Heather and John, glad to have both of you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks.
All right, so Heather, we're going to go to you first. Let's just start with the situation in Israel. What are the couple of things you're seeing right now that you think either aren't being reported in the press or are being reported inaccurately? What would you like to correct?
So that's a great question. I think, well, we could take this in a lot of different directions, Gary. Do you want to focus on internally within Israel, or do you want to focus on sort of the broader regional conflict?
All right, so I know you hate multi-part questions. Start with intra-Israel and then transition over to the US side of it. What we're seeing in the press here that might not be accurate?
I think what's most important, what I see happening in the United States with the press, there's a lot of focus, right, on who has the greater moral outrage, the sort of pro-Israeli camp or the pro-Palestinian camp. And I think, frankly, like looking at the conflict that's going on right now through that lens is not doing any side a disservice. So in terms of correcting the record, we could spend the entire hour talking about, whether Western media outlets are, where they're getting their data from, and are they not engaging in enough sort of fact-checking exercises before they send out these push notifications that spread info all over the world. And certainly, like last week's episode with the violence at the hospital was, I think, the most glaring example of that. I think it's interesting what's going on today. I know the Israeli military revealed a fairly large set of photos from the massacres in some of the kibbutzim to members of the international press, but those images have not been released to the public. I think that the IDF has, certainly legitimate reasons for concealing those photos, though I have been examining the question from multiple perspectives and think that there may actually be some value in releasing, maybe not all, but a few of them. I think it's, in terms of messaging, the most important thing that anyone in the US policy world can do is to focus on framing this through the lens of US law, which views Hamas as a terrorist organization, recognizing that this is a terrorist organization that the IDF is responding to, that this war that is opening up is going to basically be between the IDF and Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, and Hezbollah, which is also a terrorist organization. Trying to separate that out from other feelings about various national narratives. If the conflict is simply framed in a pro-Palestinian versus pro-Israeli form, it's not going to benefit either side.
Got it. Okay, thank you. John, if you were back in the White House right now, what would you be doing? What position should the United States be taking right now in the context of everything that's going on?
It's it's a very natural question to ask. I guess I have a problem with it because I think that so many of this administration's policies helped bring us to the current situation that we're in the larger global context. That the failure to deter is something that was a policy that prevailed both when it came to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and as well as this particular terrorist massacre. And it is and so it's the question, in a way, it's a perfectly good question. It's just that it's in a way taking it completely out of the context of bad policies that have led to this situation. I think that in the immediate time, I think that a huge part of this war has to do with the war for hearts and minds around the world, and particularly in the Arab world. I think that and that is fundamentally a war in the moral battle space, which is why, insofar as Israel has any vulnerabilities today, it is the accusation that it has been killing civilians in Gaza. And of course, Israel, like the United States, is as careful about distinguishing between military targets and innocent civilians as any country in the world. And so one of the issues here, I think that needs to be dealt with is to emphasize precisely the moral case that Israel is making, and to slam the moral confusion by the likes of Russia and China and others, and in the Arab world, even amongst our friendly Arab countries in the Gulf states and so on and so forth, who have been making noises much more sympathetic to, quote unquote, the Palestinians, as if Hamas represents the Palestinians. And so that's one issue. Another one also is the battle for the hearts and minds of the innocent Palestinians. This has to do with making a major effort right now to ensure that Israel will be dealing with people in Gaza who will be friendly, and who are not going to be Israel's puppets in Gaza. And so here, I think what's necessary is to do a major diplomatic effort amongst the friendly Arab states, like the Egyptians particularly, to ensure that they can help identify leaders in Gaza, Palestinian leaders who can eventually govern that territory in a way that won't be dominated by terrorist groups.
John, let me ask you a follow-up on that, because you were talking about the positions that other Arab countries are taking. There has been a trend in recent years toward normalization of relations, and it does seem that Israel was deep in conversations with MBS in Saudi Arabia to send things in a better direction. The Arab world in recent years has been signaling they're prepared to move away from the Palestinian issues and that topic in order to have peace and normalized relations with Israel. Do you think this changes it, stops it, reverses it, or it'll just slow down a process that was going to happen anyway?
I think that this has put what I hope is just a temporary halt to that process. But why did it have to halt at all? It's because these governments are reacting to their own popular sentiments, which are with, quote unquote, the Palestinians. And so this is where, in the absence of a strong moral case for Israel's self-defense and a strong moral case against the policies of the total rejectionist Palestinians, including the ones on the West Bank. And you know, there was a great article in the Washington Post, which I do not like, but it was a great article published by a professor from Hebrew University about how the Palestinians have been seeking absolute justice. And the problem is that when you seek absolute justice, you don't get justice. Cicero once had his own little aphorism, summum jus, summa injuria, which means in Latin, from the Latin, the totality of justice is the totality of injustice. And what that means is if you seek total justice and you're not willing to compromise, especially when the other side may have some claims for justice as well, then you're not going to get any. And this is the story of the Palestinians. You know, there are Palestinians who are obviously frustrated by the fact that many of them had to flee in 1948, and somebody else is living in their grandfather's house. But, you know, the fact is now generations of Israelis have been born and raised in Israel. It's their country. And Jews were expelled from the surrounding Arab countries. Israel is a very strong case for its existence, but here in the desire to have a right of return and so on and so forth, and the total unwillingness to compromise and the willingness to persecute and even assassinate those Palestinians who are willing to have dialogue with Israel. You know, this is a scandal. Israel, somebody needs to remind the world of what happens to politically moderate Palestinians who are ready to live harmoniously next door to Israel.
John, that's a phenomenal point, and it is important to note that it's not Israel saying, you know, we won't take the opinions of these moderates. They're being stopped by their own people. Heather, let me come back to you regarding something John was just talking about. Mm-hmm. And John was talking about Hamas and the Palestinian people. And so there's this open question of who represents them, right? Hamas, they were in charge. They spent years saying they were in charge, that they were the government, they represented the Palestinian people. And then the week of the attack, they came out and said, yeah, the last couple of years, we've just pretended to represent the Palestinians, to run their government. We really have just been not caring about that and focused on, planning this terrorist activity. So there is this question over who is Israel fighting? Is it Hamas? Is it the Palestinian people? Is there anyone who does represent the Palestinian people? Is Hamas a legitimate spokesperson for the Palestinians? Or how do you solve something when there's nobody who's claiming, yeah, we're in charge, we represent these people?
Yeah, I think John really hit the nail on the head and brought up a question that has been really where the light went. Sorry about that. Right now, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, there is a total lack of leadership and lack of representation for that constituency that John just hit on, the Palestinians who want to peacefully coexist with Israelis and who want to live, prosperous, productive lives. Certainly, Hamas does not represent that constituency. Hamas represents its own very limited, set of interests, which tend to revolve almost exclusively around money and violence. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has not proven itself to be an effective governing mechanism in recent years, and its lack of efficacy is evidenced by the rise of competing groups in the West Bank, many of which are defining themselves through violence. So, this is the fundamental question, and this is, I think, is really the question that young Palestinians should be asking themselves. not just those living though in Gaza and the West Bank. I think this is the most important question for young Palestinians and, and their supporters, particularly living in the West, because outrage is not a policy. You can't just get angry and then say, okay, that's where I'm going to stop. You have to propose a solution. And right now, I think this is an area where the US and other Western powers who are expressing a concern about the humanitarian well-being of the people in Gaza start planning for the day after. What does the day after look like? Who is in charge? This is totally an open question. I don't have the answer today. John doesn't have the answer. But serious efforts need to be made to identify Palestinian leaders who are capable of not just creating, a political message that can garner, say, at least a small majority or plurality of support among the population, but also those who have skills in governing, who can run political institutions, who understand basic divisions of powers, even if you're not talking about starting a democracy. That's another question. Like, what does the future of Palestinian government look like? Well, if you ask folks in the West, the default position is going to be something that has basic democratic institutions. If you ask around the Middle East, democracy is not necessarily the default answer. To some degree, it's for the Palestinians to decide, but the last time Gaza took a vote, they got Hamas, which is 15 years later going to a dead end. So, I have no question that when this war is over, that Hamas as a functional political entity will not exist and will certainly not have any sort of authority to govern the space of the west of Gaza. But what sort of governing authority emerges, I don't know, because it's one thing to sort of lean on Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon, other neighboring countries, but they don't have a national interest in getting involved here.
No, as a matter of fact, they've tried to keep themselves out for years and years.
Precisely.
Right. There's certainly more they could have done to help resolve the issue with the Palestinians. They haven't wanted to do that, and that issue has been going on for decades.
No, I think it's one thing for the Gulf nations who have money and political clout, but also a fair amount of physical distance from the actual territories, to say, okay, we're normalizing with Israel and we have our own set of incentives to do so. Egypt and Jordan took those bold steps decades ago, but the peace has been cold. So, and the proximity makes the Palestinian issue, it's a clear and present challenge, if not a clear and present danger. So it's much more challenging for them to just say, okay, well, we're moving on. They can't move on.
Right. Okay. Heather, I know one of the issues you've been concerned about, and rightly so, is the potential involvement of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think happens with them? Do you think they stay on the sidelines? Do you think they risk Israeli reprisals? What happens with Iran here?
Well, I don't think they're on the sidelines now. So, simply because we don't have Iranian flagged, soldiers trying to cross the border doesn't mean that Iran isn't involved. Iran is heavily involved now through its funding of both Hezbollah and Hamas. And I would not be surprised to see more sort of signals coming from the Houthis either in the coming days and weeks and potentially months. Though I don't think that any action on the Houthi front will escalate to a level that approximates what Israel is likely to face on its western border with Gaza and its northern borders with Hezbollah. I expect more provocation from Iran, certainly. And I don't think that Israel will hesitate to strike within Iranian territory if needed. These are, it's going to be quote unquote under the radar, but I'm sure there are a list of targets that the IDF has available. But until that link becomes, I think, something that the region is more incentivized to sever, the pattern of behavior that is currently on display is going to continue.
Okay.
So it's not a matter of, it's, it's happening now.
Yeah, no, fair enough. You're right. Iran is definitely fighting a proxy war at the moment. And Israel has hit targets in Iran in the past, sometimes on the ground. So you're right, that just because it's not in the press doesn't mean it's not happening. John, let me move on and ask you about a technically unrelated but somewhat related topic. The US now has interests in the situation in Israel as well as in Ukraine. What do you think happens? Because I think one of the issues for Israel right now is a large segment of the American public and a large segment of Congress, maybe not 50%, but a meaningful percentage of Congress is getting to the point where they're saying, we don't want to be doing this forever, and we don't want to fund this forever. So what happens now? Because I know one of the issues that you've dealt with in your career is, what do you do when you have competing demands like this?
Well, it's a great question, Gary. I think that it's remarkable how segments of the American public and their elected representatives, unfortunately, in the Republican Party, have been getting colder and colder feet about continuing to support Ukraine. We'll wait and see how things develop in the Israel-Hamas war, whether people start getting cold feet about that one. I could imagine it would happen sooner rather than later if American forces actually get involved in this war, because there are people saying this is not our war. Nobody has attacked us, although obviously there are Americans who were taken hostage. I think that this is a huge problem of leadership. The case for continued support for Ukraine has not been compellingly made by this administration. The president's Oval Office speech was okay. It was okay, but it was lukewarm when it came to all of this. And he is incapable of being a serious wartime leader, and there's nobody else in his administration that can make a strong case. But there are a dozen really good strategic reasons why to continue to support Ukraine, and also why to continue to support to support Israel. And our credibility as an ally and our credibility as an adversary are at stake in all of this. And we have lost a ton of that credibility when the Russians could do a cyber invasion of Estonia and shut that country down for a week, and then invade Georgia and barely get a wrist slap out of it, where Secretary Clinton wants to come along and push. She wants to push the reset button. What year was that? That was after the invasion, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. As if these invasions hadn't happened, they were all deterred. We just keep sending a message to our adversaries that there are no consequences for aggression and for terrorism. And the Chinese are eating this up. This is the Chinese, who are our major adversary right now, they loved the fact that we were distracted by the nation building enterprise in Afghanistan and our invasion and occupation of Iraq for as long as that went on. And they have been engaging in a massive military buildup, and we aren't anywhere close to being able to keeping up with it. Their shipbuilding capacity is many times our shipbuilding capacity. We're shrinking our Navy while theirs is growing. They've developed hypersonic missiles while we have been, we abandoned our hypersonic program 30 years ago, and now we're playing catch-up ball. Our credibility is getting worse and worse, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan was like the cherry on top of the cake. And so here you've got this accumulating failure to deter that started in the Bush administration. It got worse in the Obama administration. The red line in the sand that Obama drew against, for Assad not to use chemical weapons, and then he used them and we did nothing. I mean, our credibility, when you lose it, it's really hard to get it back. And the only way Americans can get credibility back is by electing a new administration the way Ronald Reagan came into office after the pathetic performance of Jimmy Carter.
All right, Heather, let me come to you because there's something John just touched on, which is something I've thought about, and we have a really good question from Brent in the comments. John talked about emboldening China. One of my first conclusions when the situation with Israel started a couple of weeks ago is China has to be seeing that from both a financial point of view and an attention point of view. Sorry, I add a third thing, just from a weapons production capacity. We are fully extended at the moment, dealing with wars where we're involved in one way or another on two different fronts. They've made it crystal clear they intend to take Taiwan. From a timing point of view, this has to be something they're looking at now, realizing, wait a minute, these guys meaning the United States is distracted, overextended financially, doesn't have enough ability to produce and distribute weapons. And Brent's question here, which is, I think, the right one, does China use this as an opportunity to move on Taiwan and open a third front?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be surprised. I mean, this is something that we've been talking about for several years now, Gary, you and I. And for the reasons that you just laid out, the time is right. I don't anticipate that the US is ever going to have a heavy boots on the ground, presence in Israel. I certainly hope not. I think the situation in Ukraine is a little bit more tenuous, but also playing out on a more protracted timeline than Israel. So, I mean, frankly, anytime in the coming weeks or months, it wouldn't shock me if there is a very overt Chinese action to take Taiwan in some or all capacity. They may wait several years, but they may not. And I'm sure the US military is aware of this, but it's not doing, I don't see this administration doing anything to prepare the American public for this possibility. I don't know that it is a probability, but it is certainly a possibility. And this feature of geopolitical contours at the moment, I think, needs to be highlighted much more. And the risks to the U.S. of allowing any of these allies, I think Israel and Ukraine, in my mind, may take a little bit more precedence over Taiwan. I think Taiwan, you really have to ask yourself where is the value in Taiwan? There is certainly a lot of value in simply containing Chinese aggression for the sake of containing it, and stopping, a further attempted march across Asia. But the value of Taiwan is in its people and in its intellectual resources, in what Taiwan produces. So if there's a way, to relocate those assets, you're essentially looking at a situation like Hong Kong. The value is not in the land. The value is in the system. Hong Kong as a destination for international business has lost a lot of its value since China basically took over. The same will happen to Taiwan. It will be degraded. So, the pros and cons of the US military going, full bore in defense of Taiwan, we can debate that on another call. But I do think that the viewer or the listener's question about, is this scenario, likely in the coming, weeks, months, years? Yeah, absolutely. Why not?
Heather, you bring up a really interesting point, talking about the loss of value in Hong Kong. And I know, one of the things that we've speculated on in prior calls has been the possibility that China might take a light touch in Hong Kong so they don't destroy the capitalist market there.
Yeah.
And that has not been the case. They basically have said, we want control. We want total control. We don't care how much market cap we burn. And we've seen the Chinese government make that decision with their own, mainland companies. They don't care. They'll destroy that value. John, let me come back to you on a follow-up question on Taiwan. The last time we were all talking, we had another member of the board of advisors on, and Jason was, who has served in 2 presidential administrations, right? He was a special military advisor to President Obama, a special economic advisor to President Trump. He also was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, a veteran of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan for the United States. And his feeling at the time, and I'm not trying to, to paint him in a corner on this, because these things will change over time. But at the time, he felt like the US military was capable of defending Taiwan and repelling a potential Chinese invasion. I'm wondering if you think that's still a possibility. And then the follow-up to that is, from my point of view, leaving the military aspect of it aside, we have an issue where we get, I think, something like 90% of our pharmaceuticals from China. If they do shut down Taiwan, Taiwan Semiconductor is by far the best chip manufacturer in the world. A lot of those chips are not replaceable, and they're used for applications that are much more significant than, just the latest and greatest cell phones. As Heather talked about, we are trying to onshore some of that production. Taiwan Semi and Intel are both building fab plants in the southwestern United States, but that takes years, right? I mean, we could be a decade away, and even now, we don't have the expertise in the United States to produce at the level that Taiwan does. So the whole point of this, it's really a 2-part question. One, do we have the military capability to prevent China from taking Taiwan? And 2, what do we do about the commercial aspects of this? And it's really easy for people to say, oh, you're just worried about money. But we have a military that needs chips. We have medical devices that need computer chips, and, pharmaceuticals. That's not just a commercial financial concern. That's keeping people alive. So I'd love it. I mean, it's a complicated question I've just dumped in your lap, but, take the time to answer fully.
Well, thank you, Gary. I think that we do have the capacity to prevent a successful Chinese takeover of Taiwan. But that capacity is eroding. The more and more, area denial missiles the Chinese produce, and they've got lots of them, that means that our aircraft carriers have to be pretty far away, and maybe so far away that their fighter aircraft may not easily be able to engage in this kind of a battle. Our submarines, I think, however, have tremendous capabilities, and I think that the Chinese would think twice about an invasion. I think that there are also important defenses that can be done, even physical defenses that the Taiwanese can do to prevent a successful amphibious landing. And but the Taiwanese, I think, have to get more serious about their own defense than they have been. And of course, one of the reasons why they haven't been so serious, which is the same reason why we haven't been serious when it comes to dealing with the threat from China, is that so many people have been bought off by China. Too many people in Taiwan have been doing business with China, have set up their own manufacturing facilities in China. There are, here in this country, you've got former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, former heads of intelligence agencies, retired flag officers who are directly or indirectly on Beijing's payroll. How? By they finish their government service, they join a consulting company that's in the business of opening doors for American corporations into China. And then effectively it is the Chinese who have neutralized these people. And the result is that when even such as General Milley says that the development of hypersonic missiles ought to be, especially the global orbiting kind, that can orbit high up in outer space and then all of a sudden strike. And of course, we have no defenses against these things. Well, General Milley said that this was a near Sputnik-like moment for the United States. And so where was the amen chorus amongst the elder statesmen in this country? It was complete silence, because so many of these people, they'll criticize Islamist terrorists, they'll criticize Russia, but they won't criticize the place where their money is coming from. And so there's been a remarkable political neutralization of many segments of our society, and not only the elder statesmen and so on, but sinologists and Hollywood, the media, the Washington Post and the New York Times have taken millions of dollars from Beijing's propaganda apparatus to publish Chinese communist propaganda. And even the Wall Street Journal published some of that stuff. And so there's been a remarkable neutralization effort by Chinese influence operations in this country. There's been virtually no defense against it. In 2007, one of our graduates at IWP went into the FBI, and he discovered that there is only one person in the whole FBI trying to track Chinese influence operations in this country. One person. And the Chinese have 600 front organizations operating in this country. And the Chinese Communist Party have neutralized. I don't think that they're all completely neutralized, but something like 8 blue chip think tanks here in New York and in Washington have done joint projects with and taken money from front organizations of Chinese intelligence. And so this type of neutralization that's been going on here for a long time with no defense against it has been also going on in Taiwan. And it has produced a kind of a psychological and intellectual disarmament. Some of us who think about these things worth saying, we've got to restore our defense industrial base. We've got to do a military modernization years ago. And there was, official Washington was silent about it all because people were neutralized. And the same problem pertains in Taiwan. I think that because of some statements that have been made about the colossal theft of intellectual property in this country that is depriving us not only of military and intelligence technology, but our, harming our competitiveness in the global marketplace. And then China's cover-up of the whole COVID thing has, finally awakened Americans to the threat from there. But we're still very, very slow to get off the blocks to deal what we have to deal with here. And that you raised the pharmaceutical issue. The last thing I'm going to say, we need at warp speed to restore the favorable tax arrangements in Puerto Rico or wherever where the pharmaceutical industry was prospering before they decided to tax it, and then it decided to go offshore to China and India and so on. We need to get our pharmaceuticals manufactured back in this country.
Yeah, John, that's a great point. And for people who aren't familiar with that story, what John's saying is absolutely true. The United States used to manufacture its own pharmaceuticals. They manufactured in Puerto Rico because they had favorable tax treatment. And people in Congress got angry and they said, well, why are we letting these pharmaceutical companies have favorable tax treatment? It's unfair. So they said, we're going to start taxing them. And the pharmaceutical companies then did exactly as John said. They moved a little bit to India, but a lot to China. And so now we have a problem where, one, the Chinese have exceptional influence because they can literally say, we're turning off the spigot. We don't care if these businesses lose money. We're going to kill grandma. And on top of that, we're getting no taxes at all from companies that are manufacturing in China. Heather, before we come back to you, John, I want to ask you a follow-up question, because the day you and I met a couple of years ago, you were talking about the issue of how cheap and easy it is for Chinese government officials to buy influence in the United States. It is insanely cheap for them to buy our politicians, our media, our universities, our businesses, and they have influence they 100% should not have. But I also know you're somebody who's a proud American. I know you're somebody who believes fervently in the US Constitution as a remarkable document. How do we put a stop to this kind of undue influence where so many of our people and assets and so much of our government is being bought by the Chinese without violating First Amendment rules? I mean, a private media corporation, do we tell them you can't take money from the Chinese and report on them as you want? Should businesses not be able to do this stuff? Now, I'd love to see a lot of it stop, but it's not clear to me how to go about it in a way that doesn't compromise our rules and our Constitution. How do you resolve this? Because I know this is something you've thought about deeply and you've spoken about with great enthusiasm, and certainly your words have had a huge impact on me. But I'd love for you to have a chance to address this in front of another audience.
Well, the short answer is somebody with a big bully pulpit needs to tell the truth. One has to build a pro-defense consensus in this country. And defense is not just a matter of material things. It's a matter of attitudes, it's a matter of patriotism. When our colleges and universities teach our students to hate, not only to hate their parents, but to hate America, that undermines our national security, because ultimately patriotism is the central pillar of the national security posture of the United States. You can have all the guns and missiles that you want, and if you but if you don't think you have a cause worth defending, then all of those guns and missiles are just vanity. And so there are huge elements in the non-military realm that have to be part of national strategic leadership. And to warn the American, this is where the President of the United States needs to talk about this. Chinese agents not only try to buy vice presidents and presidents and their families and Senate minority leaders and their families, and they invest in congressional special congressional districts in order to be able to have joint ventures which the congressman representing that district will defend. And then, of course, they're the congressman is defending a Chinese interest in as well as his own constituents' interests. And so the Chinese show up at PTA meetings. They recruit mayors and cultivate state legislators on the theory that they will rise up the ranks and eventually become senators and congressmen. Somebody needs to tell the truth about this. And that's part of what I consider to be proper presidential leadership. And the FBI director should be doing much more about this. The FBI director and the Five Eyes intelligence heads, are all warning about intellectual property theft. Okay, that's great. Let's wake up to that. But that isn't the only threat out there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we need to have a different conversation about it. People need to be more honest. The part I have difficulty trying to figure out a solution to, on one hand, it should be the lowest hanging fruit should be able to say government officials can't take money from China. I think the thing that makes it difficult is the Chinese Communist Party has made it crystal clear that they believe they have control over the entire Chinese diaspora, that they believe that they can control their people anywhere in the world. And so if somebody who lives here in the US connects to a congressperson or makes a donation, is that Chinese person of Chinese descent? Is that person an agent of the Chinese Communist Party? Or are they an American citizen who happens to have Chinese ancestry? And that's a very hard thing to sort out. I think it's going to be, and we need to address it. You're right. It's a crucial issue, but it's going to be very difficult to sort out because we have a multicultural society. It's going to be very difficult to sort out whether someone who is of Chinese descent is acting on part of the CCP or whether they are a US citizen with legitimate interests. And that's going to be a really tough one to address.
Gary, I think that the number of Chinese citizens who are American citizens who are acting on behalf of China is still a very small minority. I think that there are lots of Chinese who came to this country to fleeing communism. There are many who came from Taiwan. A lot of them understand what the score is on all of this. I think what's really important here when it comes to our overall strategy towards China is that our national leadership has to articulate that the Chinese people are our allies against the Communist Party. Our adversary is the Communist Party. The Chinese people, at the vast majority of them, are chafing under communist rule. American business people who go over there and say, "Well, I never met, I never met a communist when I go do business in China," but the people they do business with may not necessarily be communists, but they are people who have made enough peace with the Communist Party that they get access to capital, they get all sorts of, they get the licenses and permits, and so on and so forth. We need to ally with the Chinese people in a major public diplomacy and political warfare effort against the Chinese Communist Party. And by being for the Chinese people, it completely vitiates the argument that being opposed to China is anti-Asian hate.
John, it's a great answer. I love it. I'm just going to let that one sit there. That is a fantastic and hopeful answer. Heather, I'm going to come back to you for the last question of the day, submitted by Ramiro in the chat. He has a habit of asking really smart but difficult, challenging questions. So I'm apologizing in advance. This one is brutal, but it needs to be asked. Ramiro is pointing out, he wants to know about the media impact and the war for hearts and minds. We're back to Israel and Hamas at the moment. He acknowledges that Hamas's actions are horrifying and the perpetrators deserve to be brought to justice. And he's also pointing out that, right now the images we're getting are of the Israeli counterattack, which is very difficult and harming Palestinian families. And that's also, those images are also difficult. And so his question at the end is, what part of what we're seeing is media exacerbated, and what part of this is true and thus a moral house on fire?
So I do want to start my answer by acknowledging that Israel is really at the very beginning of a 5-front war. Front 1 is Gaza. Front 2 is the northern border, primarily dealing with Hezbollah. Front 3 is the West Bank, because things will get more violent in the West Bank in the coming weeks and months. Front 4 is terror cells within the Arab Israeli population. This is by no means the majority of the Arab Israeli population, but it is a meaningful threat in the coming weeks and months. And front 5 is the internet. Some of those fronts are more active now than others, but they're all going to become critical as this war drags on. I don't think it's impossible. It's possible to, quote unquote, win the media war, because not only, is Israel going to be fighting, the official propaganda machines of Hamas and Hezbollah, but also their amplifiers across the world. Supporters of Israel, the Israeli government, have to engage with all of that. You absolutely cannot have a policy of non-engagement. There has to be maximum engagement to try to counter that message. But I think that the more strategic move in the short term may be to try to create facts on the ground that remove legitimacy from Hamas's ability to sort of make these claims about woe the people of Gaza. So I do think that it is worth seriously considering some type of humanitarian corridor that would at least allow women and children and elderly out of the Gaza Strip. That's going to require the cooperation of Egypt, because I don't see any scenario in which they are welcomed into Israel proper. Possibly some sort of safe passage to the West Bank. But if Israel can say, to the world, listen, we, not only are we going to abide by international law to the greatest degree possible and with the best faith possible when it comes to, airstrike targeting and other sorts of operations that we have to engage in on the ground, we're opening a humanitarian corridor. Every single person that comes out is going to be thoroughly screened according to, our standards, international standards, to ensure that they are not a traveling threat, that they're not in possession of weapons, so on and so forth. But to say, listen, we don't want to, harm innocent civilians. We're going to take this extra step of allowing some sort of humanitarian corridor out. But this is a war. And unfortunately, there's already been an unprecedented amount of death and destruction on the Israeli side, perpetrated by Hamas. What is a reasonable response? You know, as I said to a diplomatic crowd last week, you know, if there was a terrorist organization that did this on any other country's border, we wouldn't be having this all-consuming conversation about it. We would accept that that other country is going to respond as it sees fit to defend its people and its territory.
Okay, well, Heather, that unsurprisingly, I ask you an impossible question and we get this thoughtful, calm, cerebral answer from you. Thank you.
Any follow-up? We can do follow-up.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna let it sit at that. I think, we're nearing the end of the time we've allocated here. I want to thank both of you for taking on such a challenging issue and being willing to talk about this in public. There are a lot of people who are hiding right now. I knew I could count on the two of you to come with everything you had. Heather, how can people find you? And, for people who are interested more in your perspective and what you guys are doing at Lumina, how can they find you?
Sure. The best thing to do is to check out my company's website. It's luminaegroup.com, LUMINAE group.com, and my contact information is available there.
Okay, excellent. And John, for both yourself, for people who are interested in your views on international policy and on China, where you've been outspoken and in the newspapers regularly, but also for young people who might want to chart a different course for U.S. foreign policy and are interested in statecraft, how can they find you and the Institute for World Politics?
Well, our website is iwp.edu. IWP is for Institute of World Politics, .edu. And I'm listed there on, as chancellor, and I'm listed on the faculty. And I've I've been doing some writing on things and a lot of speaking, and so there are, anyway, that's the place where to find me, and for students to sign up to get a serious education in national security and statecraft.
All right, terrific, John. Thank you. For everyone listening to this, this video is available on my Twitter page. It's at Gary_Brode, BRODE. It's also on my LinkedIn page, and we'll have this posted to YouTube in the next day. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to deal with such a difficult and uncomfortable issue. Thank you for being open-minded and being interested. I especially want to thank Heather Heldman from Lumina and Dr. John Lenczowski from the Institute of World Politics for both being here to share their expertise and for being a member of the board of Deep Knowledge Investing. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Gary. Thank you.